All right, hello, welcome back. It's week 14. We're moving on to Volume C, The Restoration in the 18th Century. We're not reading all of that in 2 weeks, obviously, but it would cost a lot more to order each of these texts that we're reading separately than in the anthology. And plus, you have this treasure now. If you have come to love early English literature, then you have a library at your fingertips if you choose not to sell it back. And unfortunately for you, I'm afraid they're going from the 9th to the 10th edition this fall, so you're probably going to have a hard time selling these back. That's how they get you. Anyway, it's Monday, and I'm trying to bring my energy up because I'm just feeling kind of Garfield-y this Monday. But let's get started. Let's talk about the Restoration. One of the periods of English history that I find so fascinating. So we're going to talk just briefly about context in this video and some of the social and cultural changes, and then in the next video we will focus in on that significant and very interesting Restoration author, Aphra Behn. Alright, so why is it called the Restoration? Because it was the period when the English monarchy was restored after the interregnum under the Cromwells, especially Oliver Cromwell. After a period of austere rule by Puritans, this dude comes here back to the English throne. He is Charles II of the Stuart dynasty, grandson of James I, who succeeded Elizabeth. And he's been hanging out in France for 20 years, doing fancy French things, being completely immersed in French culture. His wife is French, and when he comes back in 1660 after the deposition of Richard Cromwell, he reopens the theaters, the laws and customs that had restricted a lot of traditional English folk ceremonies and stuff are relaxed, although it never goes back to the way to the merry old England celebrated by Robert Herrick, for example. His reign is also associated with a great explosion in cultural and scientific achievement. It is in the 1660s that the Royal Society is established. The Royal Society was the first scientific organization. I think there was one in France, but there's one that gets established in England. Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle are members, the architect Christopher Wren. Margaret Cavendish, I think, is associated or publishes with the Royal Society. I forget whether she's an actual member or they let her be an actual member or not. In any case, this is also a period, though, when even though the Puritans have been kicked out of power, and it's an age of what has been called, and we'll explore this later, libertinism, where you have authors like Wilmot rejecting traditional sexual morality. It's not like everyone stops being religious or that the Puritans go away. They do, to a certain degree, turn away from politics. And there's the author John Bunyan, for example, who writes the very famous work, The Pilgrim's Progress. The Pilgrim's Progress was one of the best-selling books in English into the 20th century. And it was written by a Baptist preacher named John Bunyan, and tells the story, an allegorical story of a man named Christian who represents like the soul of all believers trying to find his way to the heavenly Jerusalem, and all the sort of trials and temptations that he encounters along the way, such as the slough of despond, this kind of like swamp of despair. And of course, John Milton writes Paradise Lost during the Restoration. I mean, we principally associate him with Puritan England, but it's after Charles has come back to power and he's basically kicked out of public life that he writes a poem about a failed revolution. Do with that what you will. A lot has been written on that by scholars about the connections between Paradise Lost and the political circumstances of his England. That's not the kind of thing we, of course, have time to get into in our survey. It is the age of the scientific revolution. this is something that I've talked about already. We have this was published as a bit of like self-promotion in the 1680s, the History of the Royal Society of London, and there's Francis Bacon, the kind of one of the inventors of the scientific method, long dead by the foundation of the Royal Society, but sort of a tutelary spirit. And there's a statue of Charles himself in the front there, not wearing his very big wig. Of course, a little sidebar here. One of the reasons wigs became popular in the 17th century was because there was a huge epidemic of syphilis, and syphilis was treated with mercury, which made you lose your hair. And so, when kings and dukes start wearing wigs, everyone else does too. Robert Boyle, who, if you've ever taken a chemistry class or 8th grade science, 9th grade science, you've heard of Boyle's law. He wrote a book called The Skeptical Chemist, where he takes issue with all the nonsense that was found in the practice of alchemy in his day. Here's a image of Sir Isaac Newton's telescope, the first to reflect light. Newton was, of course, a great innovator in the field of optics as well as of physics. But here's the thing, again, going back to that idea that it's not as if it's like, oh, okay, we're not religious anymore, we're scientific now. Newton himself, a great deal of what he published was biblical commentary, and he attempted reading the Bible to work out the date of the second coming from the prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of John. It was an age of reason, sure, an age of rationalism, but that rationalism was often put to the service of answering age-old religious questions. This guy here, Archbishop James Ussher, who was a churchman in Trinity Church in Dublin, but a member of the Church of England, the ruling Anglican Church, not the Catholic Church. He was attempted using both the astronomical tables and the Bible to work out the precise day and time of creation, pinning it, I think, in 4004 BC. His dates are actually still used by young Earth creationists to sort of fix the date of the world sometimes. But he himself was a scientifically minded person who was attempting to reconcile, it wouldn't even have occurred to him to reconcile faith and science. There was no notion that these were different kinds of truths. That would come in the 18th century. So some of the famous 17th century writers are Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, and Moll Flanders, Margaret Cavendish, who we've already looked at, Aphra Behn, who we're going to look at, John Milton, of course, John Dryden, the great critic and an epic poet and translator of Latin and Greek, a real great classical scholar, and somebody who's not widely studied now, but very important in his age. Somebody who's very interesting, that I have taught in this class before, but got squeezed out for this online section is Samuel Pepys, and I don't know why that's pronounced Pepys, but that's how it is, who didn't intend to be a famous author. He kept a diary, and that diary somehow survived, and he was a high-up government official, but he was also kind of a man about town in London in the 1660s, and his journal is both lively and interesting and reveals a lot about the mentality of the time, and describes a lot of contemporary events of the time, but also reveals a remarkable amount of, I guess it's his diary, right? He talks about like affairs he has and his attempts to like pay off the serving girl that he was sleeping with and stuff. But he also talks about going to the theater and seeing Midsummer Night's Dream and describing it as the most silly, insipid thing I ever saw. That dude on there, that's John Bunyan, of course, the author of Pilgrim's Progress, who I talked about already. So the 17th century, the Restoration, was an age of contradictions. It was a period, the theaters reopened, and for the first time, women were on stage. It was a period of, both intensifying religious interest, but also scientific interest. It's a period in which one of the interesting things about one of the interesting things about this period of the 17th century is that a lot of the things that we think about, and if you're in my history of English language class, you've heard this already. I'm going to go over it briefly, though. A lot of the things that we associate with modernity, with and not early modernity, not the Renaissance, but modern, really begins in these last few decades of the 17th century. You get the emergence of joint stock companies, like publicly traded stocks. You get insurance companies. You get global trade. You get the emergence of political parties, because even though they bring the king back, Parliament never gives up full power to the king ever again, and in fact retains the right to remove and install monarchs. This is why England is referred to after this period as a constitutional monarchy. And in 1688, when Charles will die without an heir and his brother James will be the heir apparent to the throne, James the second, I think? James the Second is a Catholic, and they're basically like, no, we're not going to have a Catholic monarch. We've been through all this. And they remove him, and they bring over King William of the Netherlands to be the King of England also, and his wife Mary, after whom the school in Virginia, William and Mary College, is named, and Williamsburg, Virginia, and Maryland, and all these places. But this is... joint stock companies, insurance, science, you get the rise of newspapers at this time. You get the emergence of what the critical theorist Jürgen Habermas refers to as the emergence of the public sphere. This is the period in which you start getting a distinction between the sort of public world of news and events and politics and the private world of family and household. Earlier on, even in the Tudor period, the Elizabethan period, there's a sense in which the world in which courtiers moved, like the whole sprezzatura world, it was all based in the household. It was all the entourage. It was all, governments were basically private households that had power over the whole country. This is the period where that changes, where government and all these other things become professionalized. Scientific knowledge becomes professionalized and more specialized as well. And this is also the period, this is important in terms of literature and literary study, when writing becomes professionalized. This is when the idea of copyright gets invented. The idea that an author might own the rights to the intellectual property to their work. Before this, a writer like Ben Jonson might make money printing the books of his poetry and selling books, but anybody else could just find those, copy those, and make their own editions and sell them. It wasn't against the law at all. It wasn't until the late 17th century that a writer owned the copyright to their work. And so Daniel Defoe was one of the first writers to get rich on the proceeds of his writing. And Aphra Behn, who we're going to be talking about in the next video, was the first woman to make a living as a writer, as a professional writer. Without further ado, let's conclude this video. I encourage you, of course, to read the section in your Norton Anthology that introduces the Restoration. It is, as always, a wealth of information. But that caps this video right now, so tune in for the next one on Aphra Behn and her body but fancy poem, The Disappointment.